Okay, so remember what I said in the bundle introduction to um, practice makes perfect and the assumptions behind that, and how we need to question whether that's really true, given that if we are engaged in imperfect practice, no matter how much practice, the thing that we're practicing for will not come to be. So I encourage you and remind you to work through this as coached by me. So now we're at argument 2. What I would like for you to do is to try to isolate each of the statements by bracketing and numbering them. I encourage you to wait to label the statements until we make sure that you have bracketed and numbered the statements correctly. I encourage you to use your notes as a checklist to make sure that you have done the bracketing and the numbering correctly. So review the notes and try to bracket and number, and then review your notes again to make sure you didn't miss anything. I'm not going to provide any silent space in this video. If you want to practice, and I think you should, then I assume you will pause the video, and on that assumption that you have done that, I'm going to go ahead and proceed. All right, so look at what this says. No way! Does that count as a statement? No, it's just kind of expressing a kind of feeling or attitude about something that someone just said, so we would not bracket and number that. Now notice what this says. According to vocabulary.com, eulogizing refers to the act of talking about how much you respect and admire them. I don't know why the word them is in there. So one thing I want to point out to you guys is that we're doing argument analysis. That's where we try to put aside our biases and opinions, our own opinions, practicing intellectual empathy, right, to see what the reasons are in support of a conclusion. The point of this exercise and this lesson is not to evaluate the arguments. So we are not focused or concerned with whether or not the sentences are compelling, the statements, or whether the argument is a good one or a bad one. First, you have to know what you're working with and be really clear about the argument that you're working with. Then we can judge it and evaluate it. But we're not doing that right now. We're focused strictly on an objective analysis without evaluating what we're analyzing. Okay, so we've got that part. For this reason, I do not think it was right to eulogize George Floyd. Are you some kind of idiot? Only a moron would think that. Okay, so we wouldn't put a statement around this, but here they're making a claim about what an internet source says. So we're going to go ahead and bracket and number that. Did you get that? Some of you might have put the opening bracket over that, and I would have been okay with that. But really, they're appealing to what they think is a reliable source. That's an important part of the argument, but I don't expect you to know that in this class. If you had an opening bracket with the number here, that would have been fine. Now, notice what this says. For this reason. They're saying, I already gave you a reason. And what's interchangeable with reason? A premise, but we're not yet concerned with that. They say, I do not think it was right to eulogize. Okay. So then they say, statement 2, I do not think it was not right to eulogize George Floyd. Okay, so it looks like there's a syntax error here. It would be okay if we're engaged in future arguments and doing analysis if we got rid of typos. You can correct those as long as they're just typos. So you would say, I do not think it was, this is what the speaker meant to say, right to eulogize George Floyd. All right. Okay, so we have bracketed and numbered the statements. Why didn't we bracket and number this sentence right here? The one that starts with R and idiot, ends with idiot. Is this a statement? No. So we should not have bracketed and numbered it. Only a moron would think that. Okay, that is a statement. It might not be a nice thing to say, it might be a vulgar thing to say, but it is still a statement. What do our notes say? Bracket each statement. Does it say does it say bracket only some statements? No. So why don't we add bracket each and every statement? Okay. I've had students not bracket a statement because they say it seemed irrelevant, or it was merely contextual, or they thought it was just opinion. If my instructions tell you to number and bracket each and every statement, you must do so, regardless of whether you would say that the statement is an opinion, rude, or expressing a feeling. You might want to write some of those warnings down, but it's not necessary. So yes, this is vulgar. This is not appropriate with respect to civil discourse, but it is a statement. So one thing that I do give you credit for when you do this kind of work in this class is, can you do the component work? Can you do the basic work of analyzing a passage to see what the reasoning is, if any, in a given argument? All right, so now we want to focus on identifying the premises and the conclusion, and of course, you will want to review your notes on that. So review this, then do it, and then after you do it, review your notes again to make sure you've done it correctly. Pause the video now and try it. Okay, so assuming you've done what I've asked you to do, using our college level reading skills and our knowledge of premise and conclusion indicators, remember you got a lesson on that in the Soft Talk module that preceded this, as well as a list of premise and indicators. I focus on this here, for this reason. In other words, reason means premise. Since they're saying for this reason, they are referring back to something they already said. So this is telling me, using the reading skills that I should have in virtue of being in this college level philosophy course, I can understand that statement 1 is functioning as a premise, a reason in support of this statement here, the conclusion. Up here, you'll notice that there was an indicator word. What was it? Or indicator phrase that I did not mention before. My reason for thinking this is true. It sounds a lot like, for this reason, I do not think. But again, you have to use the reading skills, the reading comprehension skills you're expected to have in a philosophy course. My reason for thinking this is true. In other words, my reason for thinking this, they're referring back to that, but they're telling us a reason is coming. A premise is coming. That's why we labeled this the premise and that the conclusion. All right, so now we have a premise and a conclusion. What about this? It says only a moron would think that. Does that do anything logically, strictly speaking, in a relevant way to support the claim that it was not right to eulogize George Floyd? That should, of course, be little e. Not really. We'll learn more about these kinds of statements and words in a future lesson when we're clarifying arguments and getting rid of excess verbiage. So this would not be labeled as anything, and you'll understand even better in a later set of videos when this is our focus. Okay, so now we've got this. Let's do the pattern. I encourage you to pause the video, review your notes, and try to get the pattern on your own. So I'm not going to rewrite the words pattern and diagram. I expect you to recognize when I am giving you the pattern and when I'm giving you the diagram. And like that, we free up space for notes. So here for the pattern, you should have written P-C. And then for the diagram, you should have written S1, a premise, is given in support of S2, a conclusion. Great. Let's go ahead and move to the third argument. I encourage you to bracket and number each statement and then pause there before moving on to check your answer against mine. Okay, so this says, you need to calm down, dude. Is that a statement? No, it's not a statement, it's not a sentence fragment, it's not a question, it's a command. So we are not going to bracket it. The only time we would bracket something that comes off as a command is if it's making a moral claim, like a moral rule or principle. That is making a claim about the rightness or wrongness of something. So we will make an exception for things that look like commands but are really making moral claims. In this case, this is just giving a command, so we would not bracket and number it. Do you see how I'm incorporating and applying the factual information, the what, that you got from the Soft Talk module on argument analysis? All right, so then the person goes on to say, I'm using the word eulogize in the sense of remembering someone who has passed on. And actually, they mean this, don't they? Passed on. So statement 1, I'm using the word eulogize in the sense of remembering someone who has passed on. Notice that in this same sentence, they have another statement. Therefore, statement 2, your counter-argument does not really undermine my original argument. That's the end of that statement. Did you realize that there is yet a third statement in this one sentence? I am not using that word the way you are. Statement 3. So one thing to keep in mind is, and you do not have to do this, but you might want to, warnings and tips. I'm not going to write down all of the warnings and tips I give you necessarily. I might sometimes, but when I do go like this, I'm saying what I'm talking about right now is worth writing down, but you'll not be graded for writing it down. So if you want to do warnings and tips, you can do it within your notes, your mandatory notes, or you can have a separate sheet of warnings and tips. And I'll let you know when I'm giving you warning and tips that do not have to go in your notes, even though I'm strongly encouraging you to write down my warnings and tips. Okay, so let's go down to over here. I had a warning and a tip for that. Yes. So some students, for some reason, get the idea that each sentence can have only one statement. Or they don't slow down to carefully read through a sentence to make sure it does not contain more than one statement. So it's really important, and actually right now I'm talking about warnings and tips. It's really important to remember that a sentence can have more than one statement, but a sentence may have only one statement. It's another thing to remember the following. An argument, an entire argument can be expressed in one sentence. All right, that is when you're analyzing an argument. That is definitely true with argument 3. So if you're doing warnings and tips, you might want to say, see argument 3 for an example of how a sentence can have more than one statement, and for an example as to how an argument can be stated in just one sentence. Really important stuff, guys, that I'm giving you warnings and tips because these warnings and tips are based on mistakes that I've seen other students make. So why not use their mistakes instead of repeating the mistakes so that you can do better? All right, so then our next step, as we know from the notes that we're taking, is to what? Label the premises and the conclusion. So I'd like for you to go ahead and attempt that now on your own, and then resume the video when you have done so. So of course we're not going to label this because it's not a statement, and we label only statements. If you want to add that to your warning and tips, you can do that. You label sentences as premises or conclusions only if the sentence is a statement. All right, so I don't know what statement 1 functions as until I get to this part right here. Therefore, when I go and look at my list of premise and conclusion indicators, typically tells me that a what is coming. A conclusion. Remember what I said to write down in your notes? We are working only with simple arguments. They have only one conclusion. So I'm not going to label any of these arguments with more than one C. Then I notice this word here, for. For typically tells me that a premise is coming. So this, given the for and then what comes immediately after it in context, I can go ahead and say this is a premise, and then when I use my college level reading skills and I look at these two statements, I'm like, I think that is a premise as well, especially since they use the word therefore. In other words, they seem to be saying, I've already given you a reason to think the conclusion that's coming. One thing to notice in all of these arguments is that I tend not to bracket the premise or conclusion indicator when it's at the beginning of a sentence. Another warning that you might want to write down here is that you can leave the premise and conclusion indicator out of the bracketing only when that indicator comes at the beginning of the statement. That's very important. You might also write down if the premise or conclusion indicator is in the middle or within the statement, you cannot bracket it off. Otherwise, you're going to create sentence fragments. All right, so that said, what else do we need to do with this? You can see here, how I didn't bracket for this reason. Comes at the beginning. Over here, I did not bracket my reason for thinking that this is true is that, didn't bracket that part. Here I didn't bracket therefore. All right, so if you haven't attempted to do so, go ahead and do the pattern and the diagram. So the pattern is P dash C dash P. The diagram is, and did you review your notes? Did you check your notes after your attempt to make sure you did it correctly? That is with respect to right here. Memories, guys, is imperfect. It's not infallible. Sometimes we don't learn the information correctly in the first place. So we need to look back at our notes. Maybe we see something we missed. But also it's imperfect. We don't always remember things perfectly, clearly enough, accurately enough, precisely enough. Always look at your notes. So the diagram is S1, a premise. Now we're going to learn something new when it comes to diagrams. Sometimes we have arguments where premises work together in support of a conclusion. In that case, we are going to use the symbol of a plus sign to indicate that. So we're saying S1, a premise, works together, jointly, in partnership with S what? Where's the other premise? S3, statement 3, another premise. Then we underline all that to symbolize that they're working jointly together. And then what symbol do we use to represent in support of? The downward arrow. And what comes last in our diagram according to our notes? Our conclusion. What is the statement number for the conclusion? S2, the conclusion. Okay, so now we need to add something to our notes because we've got this new thing here that I've demonstrated. So we're here where we're talking about diagram. You want to add the plus sign means a statement is working jointly together with another statement. Make sure you write that down in your mandatory notes. So this continues the mandatory notes, right? So this document here, what we have on here, continues here. Leave this space blank. All right. So again, notice how the definition for argument is manifested in the diagram. We have a set of statements, 1, 2, and 3, where at least one, a premise, there happens to be 2, right, are offered. What does the downward arrow mean? In support of another statement, a conclusion. I am pretty much reading the definition to you. In this case, the way that we would read the diagram is there are a set of statements where S1 in the original ordinary argument functions as a premise and works collaboratively, together, jointly, with another statement, S3, another premise. They work together in support of yet another premise, statement 2 in the ordinary argument, to try to convince us of their conclusion. Remember, your notes tell you never to number this. You start with statement numbers here, put the labels in parentheses. Remember, this follows the order of the original ordinary argument. That is the pattern, but the diagram does not necessarily do that.